You picked some very snappy music this time, Rick.
Well, thank you. I appreciate that, Anne.
So we hope all of you agree with Rick's choice of music. I found myself doing a little bit of this. So welcome to our event. My name is Anne Merchant, and I am with the National Academy of Sciences. And our music curator today is...
I'm Rick Lovert. I'm the program director of the Science and Entertainment Exchange, which is a program of the National Academy of Sciences.
Yes, and we're very glad that all of you are here with us. Rick's background says a little bit about our event every time we do one. And so, of course, the title today is Eat to Live. And we're looking at the science behind a lot of the nutritional considerations that we give our meals every day. And so we're really happy that all of you are here to give this some time out of your daily day, right before maybe you plan your lunch or your dinner. So good timing. And of course, the National Academy of Sciences has done a lot of work into the science of nutrition. Our Food and Nutrition Board, run by our colleague Anne Yachteen, has done some really interesting work over the years. They've been responsible for things like the recommended dietary allowances, which later became the dietary reference intakes, the DRIs. They've done a lot of work on obesity. Their portfolio, I think Sachi is dropping something into the chat, is wide ranging. And so I encourage you to go take a look at that link if you're interested in what the Food and Nutrition Board is doing. But of course, as we always say, we understand that the reports of the institution mayn't be your favorite bedtime reading, but that's why we have a program like the Science and Entertainment Exchange.
Yeah, so if you are a writer, producer, a director, actor, storyteller in any form, and you have a question about science as you are creating a yarn, you can call us. We've done over 3,400 consults since we opened our doors in 2008. So many of your favorites in which grown-ups are out there in masks and capes. We also do documentaries, graphic novels, video games. If you are a storyteller, please do give us a call. If you are a STEM professional and you are just hearing about what we do, we are always looking for volunteers to connect to storytellers. So please do reach out. We're always interested in hearing from you. And by the way, so you can find a recording of this event after the fact on our website, or you can subscribe to the Science and Entertainment Exchange on YouTube to see this event and other things that we do, like our Ask a Scientist series. So please check that out. I want to thank today's sponsors, Howard Hughes Medical Institute. We also get major funding from the Alfred P. Sloan Foundation and from so many individual donors like you. Thank you. So many of you donated this week. It was a real outsized week, and we really appreciate it. We put that money right back into this programming, so thank you. Today, we have an amazing speaker who basically put me off of eating sugar forever. And he'll be framing a conversation, and then really a truly legendary director, Oz Scott. I've looked into his credits and realized that he had written on the Jeffersons. Amazing. Anyway, I know. I can't wait to hear this conversation between Oz and Walter. If at any point during the conversation or the framing you have a question, you can put it right down there into the Q&A, and I will dutifully sending questions to Scott. We always have more questions than we have time for. We'll get to as many as we can. If Oz does not get to your question, it's definitely my fault, not Oz's, and I apologize. So my rabbit hole this week, which is the thing that caught my eye as I was researching this event, general food and nutrition. So during the pandemic, American adults drank more hard liquor and took more prescription drugs for anxiety, and yet illicit drug use among teens really fell. So I guess having mom and dad all around the house popping Xanax and drinking Chardonnay really was a real buzzkill for kids. So that's my rabbit hole for this week. So Anne, back to you.
I don't have anything quite that interesting. I don't know. So behind me is my cookbook shelf. I have a lot of cookbooks, and I recently acquired one that was very timely for this, which is The Weekday Vegetarians. And so I eat very little meat during the week. And I think that's one of the things that most nutritionists say that we should be doing. And not only that, when we do think about the way in which our diet can contribute to the health of the planet, that's the other thing that we should be considering, is how to reduce the amount of meat in our diets, or at least on our plate when we do choose to eat meat. So I highly recommend this cookbook. It's a very good one, and that's my rabbit hole. And I think Sachi dropped a link in the chat as well for that. But of course, we're going to hear more about what we can each do individually and collectively about our diets, because I think when we imagine, making changes to our diets, it's always hard to do those things. But when we think about the science of it and we really dig deeper into why and what the implications are, it starts to make a whole lot more sense to us. And Walter Willett, who is a member of our National Academy of Medicine and has sat on a number of our committees here at the institution and is well known to Ann Yaktine at the Food and Nutrition Board, is one of the people who has been helping the country steer a better course towards good nutrition and to understand why that's so important. But what we didn't know is that Walter already had a connection to Oz, and that made him immediately a member of the Science and Entertainment Exchange family. And so once we understood that he had that connection to us that we didn't know, we just thought it was an institutional connection, not an exchange connection. We knew we had to have both him and Oz come and talk to us. So Walter, we would love for you to turn on your camera and talk to us a little bit about the research that you've been doing. And we really welcome you to our stage. So thank you for being here.
Thank you very much, Anne. And I'm very pleased to share the screen here with Oz for the next hour or so and talk about some really big picture issues as it relates to diet and health in this country. I'm going to start off to get the conversation rolling, talking about the overview, the big picture of where we are today, realizing that these issues are really huge and complicated, and even a few hours would not do justice to them. So at least we can begin some of these conversations. If we're looking at the state of health and nutrition in America, probably the most conspicuous issue is the obesity epidemic that we're experiencing now. We're presently at about 42% prevalence of obesity in adults in the United States. And many people have shown this slide that's going up from about 30% in year 2000. But actually, when I started working on these issues back in the 1970s, the prevalence of obesity was only about 10%. So it's gone up almost fourfold during that time. And there's been similarly about a 3 to 4-fold increase in obesity in children as well. The huge concern is that we thought there might be a little slowing down here a few years ago, but in reality, that was a statistical blip, it seems, and the numbers are increasing relentlessly. And even more concerning is that the full health impact of even 42% obesity won't be fully experienced for 30 or 40 years down the road as people get diabetes and get the complications of diabetes and then die from those kinds of complications. This is a global problem that most countries in the world are experiencing, but not all, and I'll come back to that. We are starting to see some of the complications and consequences of the obesity epidemic. Heart disease rates had come down about 80% since the 1960s, and the whole public health community has been working on that. But during the more recent decade, that decline among middle-aged adults has stopped, and it looks like actually heart disease rates are going back up again. If you look overall, cancer rates seem to be coming down, but that's a little bit misleading because this is still the payoff from the large reduction we've had in tobacco smoking. If we look specifically at obesity-related cancers, and there's about a dozen of them, half or more of those obesity-related cancers, which had been declining, like colorectal cancer, in more recent birth cohorts, more recent generations, are on the way back up again. There may be multiple factors that are accounting for this, but almost for sure, this is partly a result of the obesity epidemic, and the generation who became overweight and obese as children are now getting into the age of cancer incidence. And not surprisingly, if we look at life expectancy in America, it was actually going down for about 4 years before the pandemic. And other countries have shown a little bit of downturn, but not all. Japan, for example, is going up steadily. That's men here, women over here. Same trend, a downward trend in life expectancy for women. And now Americans live about 6 years shorter on average than people in Japan do. And it's not just because they're in Asia. Actually, France and Italy are doing pretty well, very close to Japan in life expectancy at this point in time. Again, there are multiple factors contributing to the decline in life expectancy. The opioid epidemic is contributing, but very clearly the obesity epidemic is part of the picture there. And again, it's helpful to look at some other countries because it's not inevitable. This is American exceptionalism, perhaps at its worth. This is looking at trends in body mass index over time. And we've been steadily going up, really very different than any of the other high-income countries. And Japan way down here. In fact, Japanese women have not increased obesity over time. They're still under 5%. And again, it's not just Japan, Italy, and Asia looks like they've stopped the obesity epidemic and maybe going down a little bit there. So clearly there's some deep problems existing in America. And I think it's pretty clear that we've entered a death spiral as we gain more weight. We develop cardiovascular disease, diabetes, cancer, arthritis, many other complications of obesity. That itself helps limits physical activity. We spend more time then watching television. That encourages to eat junk food. And all around this circle, we're experiencing more subtle, more aggressive, well-researched marketing of unhealthy food. So we gain more weight. And that circle goes round and round, and it's contributing importantly to premature death that we're seeing in America. And of course, the pandemic of COVID has had a big impact on life expectancy as well. This is broken down by race, ethnicity. And it's interesting that the Latino population in the United States has had better life expectancy than white Americans. But African Americans have had lower life expectancy, and there are many complex reasons feeding into that. But during the pandemic, the projected life expectancy of Latino population fell by about 5 years, by about 1 year in white Americans, and by about 3 years in the Black population of America. So huge disparities there that existed before, especially for African Americans, and that's been exaggerated by the pandemic. We know this is a complicated picture, but we can connect a lot of the dots now that we know that income inequality is an important part of this, and upstream from that, systemic racism and other social factors contribute greatly to income inequality. That increases food insecurity, degrades the quality of diet. We know that feeds into obesity, and diet quality directly contributes to type 2 diabetes, cardiovascular, and premature death. So these lines are directly connected and indicate many places where we need to make improvements. On the climate change side, things look even more troublesome. We all knew, or many of us knew for decades, not everybody at least recognized that climate change was happening, but I think nobody really anticipated the acceleration. And it's that nonlinear increase in temperatures that we're seeing here that are really troublesome, because we're coming very close, as I think most have heard, the latest United Nations report, very close to tipping points where this trend will become irreversible. We're already on track for well above 3 degrees centigrade warming, and we need to do something about that quickly. That does have connections in both ways with our food systems. This is actually our family farm in the thumb of Michigan, a little town called Bad Axe, where our family lived for generations. This is not what our farm looked like when I was growing up, but now, like most of the Midwest, it's been flattened into vast monoculture. And this is corn here. It could use a little water at this point in the summer, it looks like. But the sad part is that of all the grain produced and consumed domestically in the United States, only about 10% is consumed directly by humans. About 45% goes through animals, dairy, beef, chickens. About 35% is for ethanol production to drive cars bigger than we need to have. And again, only about 10% ends up as grain consumed by humans. So this, you could hardly imagine a more dysfunctional food system. This is destroying the environment, and at the same time, it's undermining human health. We actually did part of a major project in which I participated, scored the national diets of all countries around the world. And there were some interesting differences, not surprisingly around the Mediterranean. The blue countries here are better in diet quality. Japan, Southeast Asia look pretty good. And some countries in North Africa and West Africa actually are surprisingly good. But United States only scores about 50 or 55 on a scale of 100. And most of the Europe is in that category, or even worse in terms of diet quality. So it's not that higher income leads to better diets and better health. Oftentimes, we find it undermining our diets and our health. I was invited and served as co-chair of an international commission, the Eat Lancet Commission, several years ago, that was charged with finding a pathway to diets that could feed the world's population and promote health and also be environmentally sustainable. We spent 3 years on that, and I won't go into all of those details or much of any of those details, but in the end, it boils down to something pretty simple. And this was called a flexitarian, might be called a flexitarian diet, because it means that if somebody wants to be a vegetarian or vegan, they can, but there's also some room for animal source foods. And it really boils down to 1 + 1, and most people can figure that out. 1 serving of dairy a day. If we go to 2 servings a day globally, that is not going to be environmentally sustainable. And about 1 serving per day of other animal source proteins, red meat once a week, some poultry, some fish, eggs, and maybe another serving of milk if we want to. So that provides a lot of flexibility. You can put this together with flavors from almost any parts of the world. And this is on a base of, in addition to these protein sources, nuts, soy, beans, fruit, vegetables, whole grains, plant oils. And we spent quite a bit of effort looking at the health implications if we shifted the world to that kind of diet, and it would reduce premature deaths by about 20 to 25%. And again, also be something that we could sustain environmentally in the long run. So there's a lot of work to do, both on the task of helping people shift to diets that would be healthier, more sustainable, and also on the agricultural side. We clearly need more research to show how we can produce foods in a more sustainable way through mixed kind of food systems, and at the same time sequester carbon, because that needs to be part of the future as well. And there are food systems that actually can be putting carbon back into the soil, although there's a huge amount to be learned about where to do this, how to do this, and what the best practices will be. So that's a quick overview of the big picture scene of where we are. It doesn't look too pretty if we follow on our current path, but there is a possible alternative pathway. And maybe we can talk about that. I'm turning this back to you, Oz.
Wow. Okay. Here I am. All right. Thank you, Walter. I guess there's a lot of questions I have. One of the things when I was looking at your charts, and I sort of mentioned this to you earlier, was you had obesity and severe obesity. And is there a definition? Because I think a lot of us, we don't know what that really means. Can you be a little more specific and define that?
Sure. These are using technical, widely used globally definition where obesity means a body mass index over 30, and severe obesity is a body mass index over 40. And that can be calculated, the body mass index, from our weight and our height. There's lots of calculators online. If you just go into Google and ask for a body mass index calculation, you can put your weight and height and get that out of there. And it's not perfect. It doesn't separate our fat mass from our lean mass, but it actually works remarkably well in predicting rates of heart disease, cancer, diabetes, and other endpoints. On an individual basis, if someone goes to their healthcare provider, That should be a number we look at, but it's usually helpful to combine that with our waist circumference and also look at how much weight we put on since age about 20. There are rarely a few people who are healthy at a BMI of 30, but actually very few people are. Almost everybody is starting to have metabolic consequences of overweight and obesity by the time they hit a BMI of 30. In fact, most people, if they put on 5 or 10 pounds, even if after age 20, are starting to increase their risk of diabetes and other cardiometabolic endpoints as well.
Okay. The first question when I was doing some research on you, the first question that I saw on the internet was, is Walter a vegetarian?
No, I would fall into that flexitarian category. In fact, I use that 1+1. It's so simple, but it really provides a way of thinking about how we eat during a day. And Anne mentioned her way of being mostly a vegetarian on the weekdays and then not so much so necessarily on the weekends. There's lots of ways of putting together this sort of flexitarian 1+1 kind of pattern. That's where I am anyway.
Okay, so that answers it for anybody who's online and looking at the same question I was looking at. Diet.
By the way, can I say that some clever Photoshop person put that bag of potato chips in my hand there during the run? And that wasn't what I was just holding the carrots.
Okay. Diet. Everyone's talking about diet. We're talking about the keto diet, this diet or that diet. They're talking about counting calories. We're all sitting there trying to figure out how to lose the weight. And on top of it, with age, I knew that 20 years ago I lost weight much differently than I lose weight now. Can you talk to that?
Yeah, those are big issues. But first of all, the point that you observed, and I think most people observed, when we hit about 40 or 45, all of a sudden, if we don't do anything differently, weight creeps up. And that's essentially because our lean mass, our muscles are shrinking, going down with age. There's no sharp cutoff there, but about that age, we start to realize that. And why our muscles are shrinking with age, that's because our what we call anabolic hormones like testosterone and insulin-like growth factor are declining with age. And those hormones maintain our muscle mass. And we don't know why they go down with age, but it's good that they do. We'd have a lot more cancer if they didn't go down with age. And what that means, because if we keep the same activity pattern, eat the same, our muscle mass will shrink. Muscles burn calories 24/7. And if we keep our diet the same, our fat accumulation will go up. The only way two ways to beat that, basically. One is to increase our exercise, including resistance training. And the second is to take anabolic hormones, but that's not a good idea. So it really comes down to, if you want to beat that system, that those trends, or at least compensate partly for them, we do need, as we get older, be more careful about getting regular physical activity. Back to your first question, though, all of the diets you rattled off, people can be overwhelmed. And there is quite a bit of research. The conventional wisdom 10 or 20 years ago was it's fat in the diet that makes us fat. And that's really been refuted in many, many studies now, including a big meta-analysis that we did. And that calories from, if anything, the overall evidence suggests calories from carbohydrates contribute a little bit more and make it more difficult to control our weight. This is one area where we do need more research, well-conducted randomized trials that last for at least a year. There's all kinds of short-term studies that are just completely unreliable when it comes to weight control. It's really the long-term that counts. But if there's one area where I think almost everybody would agree, it's that refined starch and sugar are unhealthy in many ways, including contributing to weight gain. And unfortunately, refined starch and sugar is about 40% of the calories in the American food supply, and especially troublesome where the biggest single factor is sugar-sweetened beverages. So if there's one place to be cutting out every kind of pattern whether it's low fat, low carbohydrate, it would be refined starches and sugar. And that alone those have a clear deleterious metabolic effect and make it more difficult to control weight.
Could you talk about, there was an interesting thing that we were talking about earlier about juices, because people are always, well, I'll take a glass of orange juice here, a glass of this or that to help. Can you talk about that? Because you were concerned about that.
Right. That is an important point, that fruits, I think everyone would agree, virtually everyone, are a good thing, although you can almost overdo any good thing. So even moderation there is reasonable. But when we squeeze the fruits and make them into juice, we basically end up with a beverage that has just about the same amount of sugar per glass as a Coke. And that's a standard Coke 12-ounce can has about 16 teaspoons of sugar in it. It's just so easy to put down sugar that way. I've challenged lots of people to take a bowl of sugar and eat 16 teaspoons of sugar. I've never seen anyone able to do that. But people can down that 12-ounce can and go back and have another one. It's so easy. And so the juices can be easily overconsumed and contribute a huge amount of calories. In fact, some years ago, I found I was drinking 4 or 5 glasses of juice a day. We were told that was healthy, and I realized I was putting down 600 or 700 calories just there. And it was for the same reason it's really easy to consume those calories. It's also really easy to cut them out. So that's for a lot of people. That's a good way. Now, I think it's reasonable to have a small glass of orange juice once a day. We do see some health benefits of that. So it doesn't mean that we have to totally eliminate juice, but keeping consumption low, if not totally stopping fruit juices, is going to be a good thing to do.
I want to I'll just stay with the diets for a second. Keto diet, there's been some thoughts that it's bad, bad for your kidneys. We're talking about partial fast dieting. Can you speak to that, the longer day diet?
Yeah, these are, I think, scientifically interesting areas. And what's clear is that if we look at randomized trials that have tried out different diets, the response is hugely different on almost every diet, whether it's keto or the opposite extreme of very low fat. There is a small number of people who lose a lot of weight and do well on these diets, but on average, the low fat and low carbohydrate diets do about the same. If anything, maybe the low carbohydrates diets, the overall evidence suggests do somewhat better. I think part of this is just if you go to some extreme, it means you're tuning out or putting outside of your reach most of the foods that are in front of us in America, and just that mindfulness of being careful about what we eat does seem to be beneficial for the short term. But the reality is, on almost all the studies that have been done, it's very hard for the vast majority of people to maintain these really extreme diets. And if it's not something we can live with for the long run, then it's not going to be that useful. People, I think, if they do these in a healthy way, and that would mean for like a keto diet, still making most of the proteins and fat sources, plant protein and animal plant protein and plant fats like olive oil, other vegetable oils, that would still be important to pay attention to where the fat and calories come from. So we need longer term studies. And we also need to understand better why some people have more success than other people don't.
I was reading one place where Tom Brady talked about just cutting cheese completely out of his diet. He does not eat cheese. He's never eaten cheese. Is there anything to that? Because he seems to have really kept on going for a long time.
Right. And he's pretty much a vegetarian as far as I understand. I haven't analyzed his diet, but I understand that. And he's not a bad athlete, I think most people would think, which is interesting. But in terms of cheese, almost all of the traditional cheese is quite high in saturated fat. And we do see that that's not the worst thing you can eat, but having a lot of cheese is not going to be an optimal diet. It would fall in that 1+1 group as being that if you want to have some cheese, have it in that dairy group, not more than about once or so a day. We do see some, it looks like probable benefits of yogurt as a healthier form of dairy foods. But in all of this, when we talk about cheese or meat or anything, we have to think about the alternative. If we're not going to eat cheese, what would be the alternative? If you switch to nuts, there's a huge amount of evidence that that would be a better choice. But if you switch instead of cheese to jelly and something that has a lot of sugar or refined starch, then that's not going to be any better than the cheese. So in nutrition, I think that's a fundamental principle. If we're talking about any particular food, is it good for us or bad for us? Of course, it's how much, but it's also what's the alternative, and that alternative makes a huge difference.
One of the big things, I was talking to a surgeon who said to me, one of his goals in life, this is a brain surgeon, was to do non-invasive surgery. And I said, whoa, how do you do that? And he was saying that he feels that we have the potential to cure ourselves. And I'm sure that nutrition, diet, all contributes to that. Can you speak to that? Because I think there is something in that. And then of course there are people who are saying, we don't need vaccines, we need healthier lives. I'd love to talk about some of that.
Sure. Well, that's important. And it's very clear for something like COVID, the number one preventive strategy is vaccines. And but that doesn't mean that diet and good nutrition has no role either, because there's abundant evidence now that if people go into a pandemic in a bad metabolic condition, poor diets, overweight, obese, their chance of getting severe COVID and dying is substantially higher than someone who is in better metabolic condition. But still, that you can still have, especially before vaccines, a serious risk of getting severe COVID and dying, even if you have a healthy diet. So definitely a good diet is not a substitute for vaccines. It's sort of a backstop in case the vaccine does not totally protect us. Being in a good metabolic state will still help us reduce our chance of really serious complications. So many things in life, of course, are like that. Almost nothing is perfect. And if you put on several layers of protection, that's really the best strategy.
And also here, vitamin D has been very good in helping prevent some, at least keeping the flu down and things like that. And your opinion on that?
Well, yes, that's a very hot research topic at this point. And it's also an issue that's very much intertwined with health disparities, because we've known for quite a while that darker skin and the melanin in the skin blocks vitamin D synthesis. And so African Americans have about 17 times the prevalence of serious vitamin D deficiency compared to European Americans. 17-fold difference is huge. And there's quite a bit of evidence, not absolute definitive evidence yet, that low vitamin D levels makes us more susceptible to serious infections, including perhaps COVID. There's for other respiratory infections, there's quite a bit of evidence that low vitamin D levels increase the risk. But also what's really interesting that we see low vitamin D levels are related to risk of many other conditions. I think the evidence is very strong for multiple sclerosis, that low vitamin D increases the risk. And there's a big trial that my colleague Joanne Menson has led called the VITAL study that just looked, is published some of the main results, and just a couple of weeks ago showed that adequate vitamin D supplements decrease the risk of autoimmune diseases, including multiple sclerosis, lupus, rheumatoid arthritis. Other evidence has shown low vitamin D levels are related to higher risk of dementia, type 2 diabetes, many other conditions. So what can you do about low vitamin D levels? It's really simple and cheap. Just take a supplement. And I think unless someone's really out in the sun a lot, it's logical to take a vitamin D supplement if you live in the United States, particularly the northern part. There's a lot of discussion about what's the optimal dose, but it looks like the dose, like they used in the VITAL study, 1 or 2,000 IUs per day is a reasonable dose to take. You can get too much, like anything.
Is it the reasonable? Because I've also heard 5,000 up to 5,000 a day.
Well, that's part of the discussion, and some people would even say more than that. And it partly depends on the level we start with. And again, if you have darker skin or work inside almost all the time, your level, or live in Boston area where we get not much sunshine in the winter, our levels really dive down and are low this time of year. It'll take more. The Institute of Medicine, National Academy of Medicine, has set an upper limit of 4,000 as less than 4,000 is safe. But in fact, there's not much evidence that there's adverse effects going up to 6,000 or 7,000 or so. Again, we don't have a sharp cut point there where we can say it's too much, but keeping intake below around 4,000 is probably reasonable. We did a study in Boston area to look at what for African Americans living in Boston area, what level would it take to bring the levels up to what seemed to be optimal for reduction of colorectal cancer. It took about 4,000 IUs to do that. But again, for most people, I think while we're trying to learn more about what's the optimal amount, 2,000 is a good number.
Okay, I'm trying to get to some of these questions that people are asking too. There's been multiple questions about fasting. How do you feel about fasting?
Yeah. Well, I think we don't really have all the answers to that. If it's fasting and then gorging and overdosing, that probably is not we exceed our capacity to process the large amounts of carbohydrate and fat. But there is some evidence that this intermittent fasting pattern may make it easier for some people to control their food intake. Again, this is an area where we need longer term studies. The evidence is not conclusive, but it's interesting for weight control. Unlike something like cancer prevention or heart disease, people can experiment on their own and see if intermittent fasting works for them. I think that's okay, but I think it's still important to pay attention to what we eat, not just when we eat it. That diet quality, whether it's 3 meals a day or intermittent fasting, the diet quality is still going to be important. And along the pattern that I was describing earlier and that Anne mentioned as well.
I sometimes use artificial sweeteners. I have my protein bars. I found that soy was just really wrecking my system up. I usually use whey protein. Do you have any comments on that? And is that sometimes worse than sugar in a different way?
Yeah, artificial sweeteners, and I put them in a category sort of like the nicotine patch. Almost for sure better than the real thing, the real sugar sweetened soda, but it's not likely to be the ideal solution for most people. We prefer to have people drinking water, for example. But we've looked pretty hard at that and don't see the same increase in diabetes, weight gain, and mortality with artificially sweetened beverages that we do from the regular Coke. So almost for sure, it would be better to have that artificially sweetened beverage soda than to have the full sugar soda. Nicotine patches have been helpful for a lot of people.
Okay, I want to read this question because I don't understand it, but since it's there may be something you'll get it. Discuss the controversy between carbohydrate insulin model versus the energy balance model.
Okay, well, right. We just published a paper on that a few months ago. The paper is motivated by the one argument that's been sort of the conventional wisdom in nutrition that all calories are the same, and in terms of weight gain. But the carbohydrate insulin model basically hypothesizes, and there's a good amount of evidence to suggest that there's something to it, that not all calories are the same. And we've known for quite a while that insulin does promote fat storage. So the idea is that eating foods that don't generate the same increase in insulin could be advantageous for helping to control weight. In other words, with a lot of insulin, we're pushing our calories into the fat. And it does try to address this issue that in some ways it's such an enigma that we almost ignore it. But how can somebody be 50 or 100 pounds overweight, carrying around on their body enough calories to feed them for months and still feel hungry? Somehow those calories in our fat are locked up and we're not able to access them and burn them off and just lose weight. And that is part of the enigma that the carbohydrate insulin model is addressing. Now, I think it's only part of the picture in terms of our epidemic of obesity, that, again, this aggressive marketing of putting sweet, flavored, nicely packaged, heavily marketed foods, seductive foods in front of everybody within reach almost 24/7 is part of the obesity epidemic. But this carbohydrate insulin model suggests that, again, going back to the foods that do increase insulin the most, sugar and refined starches, that the quality of our diet is part of the reason it's difficult to control weight and contributing to this epidemic that I described earlier.
We had talked about at one point about, what do you call it, aquaculture, and how to feed our world because we have so much ocean is there. Can you talk about, because fish and kelp, seaweed, things like that, how about those for nutrition?
Right. Yes, it's fish consumption is in general healthy, again, compared to something like red meat. And it does, fish contain a good amount of omega-3 fatty acids. It varies from one species to another, but in general, there are very good sources of omega-3 fatty acids, and much of the world is short on those essential types of fatty acids. So, this commission that I mentioned a little while ago did suggest that globally it would be desirable to increase fish consumption substantially. Parts of the world have almost zero fish consumption, big parts of Asia, Central Africa, for example, that are far from the sea. And the problem is, of course, that we're already almost maximally fishing, in some places overfishing the oceans. And so we really can't count on the natural seafood for a large increase in fish consumption. And that means we're going to need to increase consumption largely through aquaculture. And I think that points to a research area. How do we do this the best way for both health and environment? There are horror stories about some aquaculture systems, but there's also good practices in aquaculture as well, and especially for not just fish, but bivalves like mussels and clams producing and oysters in aquaculture systems. They are very efficient converters of feed to protein. So again, how do we do this in the best way is really an important research agenda, and one of the areas where the Department of Agriculture should be investing.
Several questions around federal policies and how it shapes poor diets. Yeah.
Right. Yes. that's hugely important. And I think it points to this whole general issue, and the number of National Academy of Medicine reports have looked at this issue of how can we promote healthier diets. And it's much more than just telling people they should eat this instead of that, because for many people, good diets are not accessible or affordable. And to a great degree, that is influenced the affordability and availability is influenced by federal policy. And we can help make healthier foods more affordable by lots of different kinds of indirect and direct subsidies. We're unfortunately mostly subsidizing production systems for unhealthy foods, like our family farm I showed you in the picture there. There's a reason that those farmers plant these vast monocultures of corn, and that's because it works best economically for them. And it doesn't have to be that way. The system works that way because we've set it up for farmers to make the best money off their acres by that kind of food system. Also, I think we really have to have some constraint over advertising of unhealthy foods to children. The Kaiser Family Foundation did a study a few years ago looking at the advertisements that children saw for food over a year. And on average, kids saw about 2,000 advertisements for food. The number for fruits and vegetables was 0. So they're getting push, a very aggressive, very subtle kind of advertising to eat junk food. You can't blame the kids for arriving at age 18 overweight and obese. And we really need to end the exploitation of them, literally for profit.
Could you talk a little bit more about, I know that you were doing some research on children's eating habits that contribute to cancer and obesity and other things. And what has that research shown you?
Well, there's a growing body of evidence there. We need, in fact, more evidence, though. The biggest single factor contributing does go back to the first topic you mentioned, sugar-sweetened beverages, that in lower income groups, the average number of servings of sugar-sweetened beverages per day is 3. And that's a huge amount of calories from right there, and a huge amount of evidence that does show that contributes to weight gain and obesity and premature diabetes and premature death. So that's a very good starting point. But overweight in children, we also see is related to cancer later in life, particularly colorectal cancer. We have a lot of data on that now. We've also seen, we're just starting to get data on adolescent diet and cancer outcomes. And we do see that higher consumption of whole grains and more fruits and vegetables, particularly dark green and orange vegetables, is related to lower risk of breast cancer later in life. So that lots of connections are emerging here, and we need more data. Our study that we've been conducting for the last few decades is one of the very few studies that has looked at this. We really need more data, but what we see is painting a picture that diet during that period of life is even more important for cancer prevention, especially breast cancer, than diet during midlife. And it means we're feeding our children poorly, and that has consequences for their lifelong risk, quite directly, we're seeing.
And one thing you said to me, and I just want to say this, is that in this research, dealing with kids 1 to 10 is much harder than dealing with teenagers, because 1 to 10, because they're going to school, it's harder to calculate what foods they're eating, as opposed to 10 to 12 to 15-year-olds who can write down what they're eating.
Right. That age from 1 to 10 is a huge blind spot in research, because basically nobody knows really what they're eating. The moms and fathers send them off to daycare, then school, and it's hard to know what they're eating there. We did send off some years ago a young child and with a nice apple and sandwich to daycare, and he came back really proud that he had managed to trade that apple for a candy bar. And that was really a major accomplishment. So yeah, we don't know what, even if we pack our lunch for them, we don't know what the kids eat. And of course, at that age, the kids can't report their consumption accurately either. So it's challenging. There are people working on this, trying to get some information. We're maybe making a little progress, but that's a particularly challenging age. By the time kids are 12 and 13, we do see that they can start to report their diet with some accuracy. It varies from child to child a little bit, but before that age, the challenges are great.
We have a few questions about quality of life versus life expectancy.
Right. Yes, I think very appropriately, people have wondered if we do everything right, and live longer, are we just going to end up with more years in a nursing home, which wouldn't be a very good outcome. But we did publish a paper just a year or so ago in the British Medical Journal looking at the added years of total life that we would get by 5 healthy lifestyle behaviors: good diet, physical activity, not smoking, moderate alcohol. And we found that practicing all 5 good behaviors could add about a decade of life. And those were all added healthy years. That was a really very, I think, encouraging conclusion there. We didn't add any extra years of unhealthy life. All those added years were good years. So I think that's a pretty good incentive to pay some attention to what we do.
I'm going to throw 2 things at you. Insect protein and bacteria microbiome diets and health. If you can understand that, I can't.
Right. Yes. In the microbiome and insect proteins. Sort of different topics, I guess. But
they are different. So take them
right. There is a lot of interest in both of them, and it's interesting. I don't know any study that really has long-term data on health effects of insects, but the reality is in many parts of the world, they have been part of the important protein sources for populations. And at face value and analytically, they do look like they are good protein sources, and many of them can be fed food that otherwise would be outside of our food stream. And that's good reason to look at these further and the practicalities. I've had cricket pasta. It tasted perfectly fine. I put some good sauce on it. I think no one would have known the difference. And it was probably healthier from a nutritional standpoint than usual, just plain wheat pasta. The microbiome is getting huge attention. And it's something that I had been wanting, and other people have been wanting to study for decades. But what has really opened this up is the ability to actually get a stool sample, even just a pea-sized sample, and use modern genomics to genotype everything that's in that stool sample. And by doing that, you can identify what's living there in that sample, mostly bacteria. So that's opened up research area. Before, it was just, you had to get fresh stool, you had to do lots of different kinds of cultures to figure out what was going on there. And our research staff said they were going to quit if we wanted to do a stool collection like that again. This was back in the 70s. But now you, again, can collect a little sample on a card through the mail and do these kinds of analyses. So we've just about finished up a collection of from about 20,000 participants in our large nurses' health study, and putting those in the freezer to be able to do prospective studies. So far, almost all the studies of microbiome, again, what are the organisms living in there and health outcomes, have been cross-sectional studies. We have very limited prospective data there, which we should have, because we're always concerned, is the disease the result of what's in our microbiome, or is our microbiome affected by having disease? There's strong hints, though, that microbiome can influence our risk of diabetes, neurodegenerative diseases, and cancers as well. So there's strong reason to pursue this further. And I think over the coming decade, we'll learn a lot more. Importantly, though, what organisms are growing in our intestines is largely determined by what we eat. That's the fuel for the bacteria. That's the diet of the bacteria that live there. So if we want to change our microbiome, the first and probably most important way to do that will be by changing our diet. And from what we can see, this kind of diet that is more plant-based will produce a healthier microbiome.
Okay. We are told that inflammation is the source of many chronic diseases such as arthritis and cancer. Are there any certain foods that promote inflammation that are there specific foods that you would recommend?
Yes. One thing that's important to keep in mind, there's a huge amount of interest in anti-inflammatory diets, but the biggest factor influencing inflammatories is actually overweight and obesity. That's the elephant in the room for levels of inflammatory factors. And again, and it's part of the pathway probably leading from overweight and obesity to many risks for diseases. But in terms of specific dietary factors, yes, we have developed an anti-inflammatory diet score where we took data on inflammatory factors from about 10,000 people and looked at the foods that predict more inflammatory factors. And it ends up close to being what I described as a sort of Mediterranean type diet, having lower inflammation potential. In general, refined carbohydrates and red meat were related to more inflammatory factors, and most fruits and vegetables, not all of them, were related to lower inflammatory factors. Olive oil was related to lower inflammatory factors, and interestingly, alcoholic beverages are related to lower levels of inflammatory factors as well. But drinking
alcohol or not drinking alcohol?
Yeah, lots of complexity there. We can go into that if you want to.
We're getting down to the last minute, so I've got one thing that we as artists are always looking into is science fiction and how science fiction affects, our relationship with science. Is your dream. I'd love what is the most outlandish thing that you would love to either do research on or that you have questions about that in 5 years, 10 years, may be something that comes about from nutrition that we may not have ever thought about, that I'm sure you dream about weird things in the middle of the night that you like, one day I want to get around to this. Do you have any of those thoughts?
Not exactly. And maybe one of the points that I would like to make is that we're headed into this death spiral not because of bad genes or deficiencies in novel drugs. And we put almost all of our investment into that kind of research, and just a little bit on figuring out how to have people eat and enjoy a diet that is healthy. That's my dream, actually. And there's a lot that we have to learn to make that happen.
We're really down, so I guess is it. I mean, Rick and Ann, I think that you should get on, but I think you should do the after event because there's probably another hour or two that folks would like to talk. And the last question, real question, is there a difference between tea and coffee, green or black?
Coffee has received a lot of research attention, and 40 years ago, there were lots of concerns it might cause cancer and heart disease. And the amazing thing is that it doesn't cause cancer or heart disease. And in fact, there's very strong evidence now that there's a modest reduction in heart disease and cancer and type 2 diabetes with coffee consumption. We're still not quite sure what it is in coffee that's beneficial, but it's really loaded with antioxidants. It's the single biggest source of antioxidants in the U.S. diet, partly because people consume a lot. Tea it may have some benefits, but the evidence is not as consistent and strong as it is for coffee. So far, no evidence to distinguish black tea from green tea, except that going back to what we talked about earlier, you can undo the benefits of coffee if you load it up with sugar and cream, like so many people do. And the English do the same thing with their tea as well. So in general, the green tea that's not going to be consumed with a lot of sugar and milk and cream is probably going to be better.
Okay, and the last question to Rick and to Ann. Have you put on Walter's books and websites onto the chat so people can find out where to read more, as opposed to relying on my Facebook MD when I give diagnosis to people?
I don't know if that's true. We have to find out from Sachi whether we have done that or whether we can do it, but we can certainly make sure to drop it in the chat or to put it in successive emails that we send out, Oz, and we'd love to be able to do that.
And we'll put it in the show notes on our website if you're watching the recorded version.
Exactly. And this has been great. I feel better about my morning coffee, and I feel better about my choice as a flexitarian. And reducing my meat consumption. So, and listen, I think you're right. It's about finding the foods we enjoy and still being healthy and nutritious. So thank you both. This has been a great conversation. We knew it would be. And we know that our audience had more questions than you could possibly answer. And it's all Rick's fault that you couldn't get to them, as we promised. So we hope that you come back for our next event. We're going to be doing something on world building, both the way in which world building unfolds on screen, but also the way that creative process is applied to how we envision our future in real life. So join us. We'll make sure that invitation is in your inbox, and we look forward to seeing you on April 6th.
Yeah, I have a few people I want to thank really quickly. First, everyone who asked a question today. As Ann said, we had over 90 questions today. Thank you, everybody. Everybody who joined at our supporter level, $100 or more, thank you so much. We can't do these events without your support, and we really appreciate you. Also, Courtney Sloan, Sachi Gerben, Jeff Fishman, Amechi Ukpabi for technical producing, and also Oz Scott for bringing us the idea for this event. It was fantastic. Thank you, Oz.
Yes.
And we'll see you next time.
Exactly. Bye-bye.